And I seem to find opportunity to talk about topics that I am passionate about. So I do want to say that I am passionate about the topic of research ethics. Um, the invitation suggested that I will talk about research ethics principles. I think that's very relevant for postgraduate students mostly. Um, but my passion extends beyond the principles. So I am going to go a bit beyond the principles. So I'm going to go back to the conversation from yesterday, which is the theme of our workshop for these 3 days. And then I'm going to get into the research ethics principles. So for these 3 days, we are talking about informality of the African city. And I'm going to try and link that to how we do research from a research ethics point of view. Prof, just to double check again, are my slides moving on your side? Hello? They are moving. Oh, sure. Because I've been in another webinar where my slides were stuck on the first slide and I was not aware. And then I went on and halfway, people were not sure what I was talking about because it was not reflected on their side. So we have heard yesterday from Prof about the making of the cities that the fellows come from. The fellows for these 3 days come from Accra, Nairobi, Cape Town, and Johannesburg. You may have been born in the city or you may have moved to the city. But what's important when we talk about research ethics is to imagine. And I would like to invite all of you to have this imagination. I would like you to imagine the past. So the past that I would like you to imagine is the colonial past. I also would like you to imagine what I call in today's presentation the present, which is the post-colonial era. In South Africa, for example, it also includes the post-apartheid era. I also would like you to imagine the future, which is the post-COVID era, because a few things are going to change post-2020. So we're going to have a post-2020 era, which is going to be very important. I am not a historian, but I tried to check this information. So if it is not correct and there is a historian amongst us, please feel free to correct my information. So there is some information that suggests that Kenya has been under colonial rule for about 43 years, and that Ghana has been under colonial rule for about 136 years, and that South Africa has been under colonial rule for about 309 years, and you add the 33 years that we've been under apartheid, and that brings us to 342 years. We take the cap. Yeah? So, I need you to go to the chat box, and in the chat box, I need you to type your answer to this question. I'm going to ask you a question. When you think about the number of years that your country has been under colonial rule, if you come from Kenya, from Ghana, from South Africa, please just type for me how many generations would fit in that period. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to type for me how many generations would fit in that period. I'm going to look at your answers. I'm a teacher, remember, Prof. So, no, how many generations would have lived through that period? So if your country, your own country, if you're from South Africa, how many generations would have lived through 342 years? If you are from Ghana, how many generations would have lived through 136 years? And if you are from Kenya, how many generations would have lived through 43 years? Please type on the chat because I'm going to go back to your answers and we're going to give marks for this. So it's very important that everybody puts their answers on the chat. I can see. Good. So from my side, I tried to do this exercise and using 16, the age of 16 as the reproductive age for women, I came up with about 2 to 3 generations of Kenyans who were under colonial rule, about 8 to 9 generations of Ghanaians, and about 21 to 22 generations of South Africans. Earlier today, I think it was Stella who, in concluding her presentation, said something about what we are trying to do in the post-colonial, apartheid era is to tell African stories, the African ways. And I want you to imagine whether we do know these stories anymore. Because if you've lived under colonial rule and about 21 to 22 generations of your people have lived under colonial rule, I wonder if we have been able to keep the intergenerational dialogue in such a way that we are able to tell these stories the African ways. That is what we want to be able to do, and we want to be able to bring the conversation of research ethics into that. So before this webinar, I asked that you watch a video where I gave a presentation about research ethics, and I'm hoping that you did watch the video, because we don't have enough time today. We've got only 1 hour. We will not be able to repeat some of the hopefully interesting stuff that was discussed in that webinar. So it is my hope that you watch the webinar and you will be able to link what I'm saying to what we discussed in that webinar at the Historical Trauma and Transformation Unit at the University of Stellenbosch. And if you are from Kenya, I also need you to think about when did Kenya become free. And if you are from Ghana, I want you to think about when did Ghana become free. And if you are from South Africa, I want you to think about when did South Africa become free. And I want you to calculate the number of years that you have been under colonial rule, which means everything, including your education system, was colonial. And I want you to now look at the number of years you've been free, and to make your own imagination of whether you are able to go back and tell your African story the African way. What is the African story? Because clearly the African story has been tainted. So is our way of telling the story. Because remember, research is our way of telling the story. It's our way of first producing the story, because research is a knowledge production exercise. So once you have produced the story through research, which is a knowledge production exercise, you then tell the story through research communication. And that is why I had earlier in the webinar, I think it was you, Prof. Ambati, or if it was Sanele, suggesting that there needs to be also some webinars around research communication. So the way that we have been communicating the African story for all these years has been under the influence of our colonial masters. So it's very important for us when we do research to always ask ourselves, what research question am I asking? And what does it mean to the people who occupy this space? Because the issues of ethics are also about the research questions that we ask. What research question am I asking? And what does it mean to me as a researcher that I am asking the question that I'm asking? On whose behalf am I asking this question? Is this question the African question? Is this question the necessary question to be asked at this point in time in this particular context? And what research question am I asking, and what does it mean to my funder? Because a lot of our research studies funded. Very few of us undertake research that is self-funded. At least you could do this up to an honors level, but from masters onwards, we always have external funding for our studies. So it's very important that we ask the question, what does my research approach, how does my research approach take into cognizance the circumstance of the informal, African city? And this was discussed yesterday. I think also it's something that you, the fellows, engage with from time to time through your own literature review. So what are research ethics? I need you to think about the background that I've just given you, but also to now answer the question, what are research ethics? We know that knowledge production is quite often unpredictable. It is specific, it is context and situation specific. And some of the things that we discover when we are in the process of producing knowledge can generate moral ambiguities for us and moral uncertainties for us. And research ethics fit in exactly where there are moral ambiguities and uncertainties. And so as a community of practice, as researchers, we then have an agreement that this is how we should treat our research. This is how we should treat knowledge production. This is how we should treat going into the field. Remember, this is not cast in stone. Research ethics are principles that we come up with as researchers, and then we have consensus. Once we have consensus, then we publish these research ethics, and then we teach the students about them and expect everyone to follow the ethical way of doing research. Recently, I saw something on the news, and I wonder if anyone in this webinar today also saw what I saw on the news. And I'm going to ask you if you saw this. And again, I'm going to ask you to go to your chat. When you get to your chat, please type if you saw it. If you saw what I'm going to show you now, type me. If you did not see it, type not me on your chat. So if you saw what was published about the Lancet, and the headlines went something like, the Lancet published a fraudulent study, and the editor of the Lancet calls it department error. How convenient. A fraudulent study, department error, Lancet, editor. You can imagine, we all respect the Lancet. It's a, everybody wants to publish in the Lancet if you are in my field. And because the Lancet is the top notch of our journals, we hope that it's got reviewers and editors who know their job and who are doing a good job. For us, in August of 2020, to be hit by headlines, the editors of the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, they complain that pharmaceutical companies are so financially powerful that they pressure them to accept papers. And this news was spilled by the editor, Vera Shave of the Alliance for Human Rights Protection on the 17th of August. You can go and Google it. I hope that it is factual news. If you go and Google this and you have seen it, maybe you've seen it, maybe you have not seen it. But if these top-notch journals that we all aspire to be published in one day can behave in these ways, what does that say about the importance of continued training on research ethics? It says a lot. I'm sure you will agree with me. So research ethics in knowledge production are dilemmas, and they are present throughout the study. That is why I start you with the end of the stick. The end of the stick is your paper that has been published. And some of us, in fact, many of us, I can imagine, once the paper is published, you never go back to read it, right? So that is the end of the stick for many of us. So the ethical dilemmas are present from the day you ask your research question. That is why I started by asking you to reflect on your research question, to the day your study is published. And you are not the only one responsible for this production of knowledge. Remember, you and your supervisor need to be ethical because you are both responsible for this. All of us as fellows in this group should be responsible for these ethics. But the peer reviewers of our articles should also be ethical, and so should be the editors of the journals where we hope to publish our PhD findings. So everybody has a responsibility in the production chain of knowledge. That is why it is important for us to have this training, and we continue to have it, not only once. So this is the textbook definition of what ethics are. That ethics are universal principles. However, the consideration of this and the meanings for a specific researcher, so says the textbook, may differ depending on the context. You will see in my slides that I have cancelled may, and in fact I suggest that it should differ. Why should it differ? Because as we have seen earlier on, for so long, we the Africans, we have been excluded in consensus building around what constitutes ethics in research. So now, because we have fallen in line with the global north, we did not have an opportunity to define what research ethics means for us. So in fact, the application of the universal principle should differ. We are not going to come into the space and throw the baby with the bathwater. No. A lot of work has already been done. However, there is room for us to always contextualize the application of the ethics that we have studied. So ethical principles are principles that guide how we do research. So remember, that's my view. You may agree. You don't have to agree with me. Please bear with me on that one. But that's my view. But ethical principles should not be about what and what and what and what. So it should not say what is informed consent, which I'm going to do right now, and what is confidentiality, what is privacy, and what is all of this. But it should be the how. How do we do what needs to be done? So if it is about making decisions about whether this action is right, this action is correct, and this action is appropriate. And please remember, something may be right, but inappropriate. Something may be correct, but inappropriate. So that is why it is always important for you, the researcher, to justify why did you do what you did in the ways in which you did it. It may not have been the appropriate thing, but it may have been the right thing at that moment for you to do. So it's very important that when we talk about ethics, we reflect on the how. I know that sometimes as students, we interested in getting the ethics clearance and that's all. But my conversation around ethics is, yes, useful for you to get ethics clearance, but useful for you to be an ethical researcher, because that's what I am interested in as a scholar. I'm interested in all of us being ethical in the ways in which we do our studies. So, when I talk about contextualization of ethical principles, I need you, because our fellows for today come from East Africa, West Africa, and from the Southern Africa. So I need you to think about what is the right thing to do in Ghana. Because remember, the right thing to do in Ghana may not necessarily be the right thing to do in Kenya. It may not necessarily be the right thing to do in South Africa. Recently in South Africa, for example, if you think that spanking your child is the right thing to do, you are just asking to be popular with the Chief Justice, because the Chief Justice does not think that it is okay to have to met out corporal punishment. So whilst you might think that it is appropriate because you're trying to mold your child, it is actually against the law in South Africa to beat your child, right? So we've just outlawed corporal punishment in South Africa. So in fact, in a different context, the same behavior may be acceptable by law. So for example, I'm going to make a lot of examples from South Africa because I am more familiar with this context. In South Africa, I think it was last year in 2019 towards the end, and it happened within a short space of time that there was a paper from the University of Stellenbosch that was published. Some of you may be familiar with it. I'm familiar because it was in my field, I think in psychology. So it was an embarrassment for my field of psychology. The paper was found by South Africans who read the published paper to have relied a lot on race science. So reliance on race science for that paper resulted in the paper actually being racist in the context of South Africa. I do not know who the authors are. I do not know what they were thinking. I've never met their research team, nor their peer reviewers, nor their editor. But in the whole team, in the whole knowledge production, nobody saw that there was a problem. This paper, it is unethical. It is not appropriate. It is wrong in the South African context to write a paper that makes such conclusions about black people. And so that paper had to be retracted from the journal. I don't want my fellows to be one of those who write work that is inappropriate. There was another one soon following that one that was from UCT, and the professor from UCT, don't think highly of us professors, the professor from UCT even had to resign from work because of the article that they wrote last year. And that article, remember, came from years of work and probably funding put into it, and students coached with this work, and this work was eventually published in a journal. And this paper was found to have also relied on on race science. And in South Africa, we take that very seriously. So in South Africa, it is inappropriate, it is not right, it is not correct. It is all of those to produce work that is racist. In a different context, it may be illegal, for example, to have abortion. In South Africa, it is okay. So in South Africa, the work around abortion is okay. In South Africa, the work around homosexuality is okay. It is appropriate. It is right. However, not everybody agrees with that work. Some people frown upon the work. So if somebody frowns upon those values, they may then make research decisions based on their values. So it's very important that as fellows, we also acknowledge that we bring into our work our own personal values. Our research is our professional identity and our professional lives, but we've got our personal identities and personal values, and we may bring these into the professional space. So I know that students are mostly interested in research ethics, and I'm going to move to research ethics because we don't have enough time to talk about what Professor Duna is passionate about, which is the personal, professional, tensions in research ethics. So in terms of the research ethics principles for the next minutes, I'm going to, this is my categorization, so I've categorized them for you into 4 groups, and these are not all the research ethics principles. I know that in your honors and masters courses you were introduced to research ethics. So I'm going to talk about yourself as a research instrument, just to build on the argument I've just made now about bringing yourself and your own personal values into your work. And I'm going to then talk about justice in research, doing just in research. I'm going to talk about respect for persons, and I'm going to talk about beneficence, and you are familiar with these concepts. So as I've just started by introducing the concept that as a researcher, you are the research instrument. As a researcher, you function as an instrument for observation studies in these informal cities. You collect the data in these informal cities. You analyze the data. And remember, when you get to the stage of analysis, you introduce a lot of bias in terms of which variables do I want to analyze, and which variables do I want to correlate with each other, and which variables do I want to put into my regression model. That is you making that decision. Yes, you can tell us that it is informed by literature review and by theory, but we know that you then are the person. Those variables don't just jump into your computer and pop themselves into a model. You create the model. We are aware of that. But once you've got your findings, your output, poops, then you have to interpret it. How you interpret that is also very important, because you are the instrument. Remember, the mean and the median and the p-values, they don't interpret themselves. You interpret that. You then tell the story about your research findings. And the story you decide to tell says a lot about you as the research instrument, as the person. So you shape the research questions, you immerse yourself in the lives of the individuals that you are studying, or you are studying the organization and the community, and you become part of the data. You get associated with the data, and by so doing, there is both danger and opportunity. I've just given you examples now of people who had to lose their jobs or lose their prestige or be questioned by colleagues because of the way that they have conducted themselves. So we caution you that it's very important that you are self-aware when you do the research around informality and informal cities, especially because, as we heard yesterday from Professor Anyumba from Kenya, there is a level of judgment that we pass when we talk about formality and informality. That dichotomy suggests that one is subaltern, one is superior. And so because there is a level of judgment that we pass when we talk about people who are in the informal fringes of our cities, it's very important that we are aware of that. We encourage you to develop insights into the research phenomenon and the research site. That is why it's important that you read and read and read and read and read again. When you're a PhD student, there is never enough amount of reading. You should always read. And you should also make sure that you don't misuse yourself in the process. I do want to promise you that there is awe and profound respect that accompanies the personal and professional experience of being a researcher. I'm going to give you an example of why I say it's very important that we are aware of ourselves and the values that we bring, because ethics are drawn from these values. So MN in this example is myself. My name is Mzikazi and my surname is Nduna, so I've initialed my first name and surname. And IE is a person that I worked with in a particular project. I'm going to call this person international expert because that's how they were introduced to me. They were an international expert. So this is not their real initials. We were writing about everything else in this report. It was a research report. And amongst all the good things that we wrote in this report, because I think at this stage we write good things, I had also included in this report, because the report was about issues of social cohesion and about race as well. So I had included in this report that part of the challenge for us as South Africans is that Afrikaner nationalism seems to be an indicator of racial fault lines. And we see in South Africa, for example, the re-establishment of Afrikaans enclaves in the form of the Afrikaans University. Some of you might know that we are building an Afrikaans University in Centurion in South Africa, where there will be tuition in Afrikaans. So we are, in fact, being nostalgic, some of us in South Africa. And some of you might also be aware that there is a small town in South Africa called Orania, which is an Afrikaans town. Everything there, they speak Afrikaans, they do business in Afrikaans, they have their own currency in Afrikaans, like they believe they are the Republic of Afrikaans. And for some of us, that's a problem. That's a problem because it takes us back to pre-1994, and we wish that we don't have to go back to pre-94. But I want to stop here and tell you that between myself and IE, this was a bone of contention. He did not agree that this was a problem in South Africa in 2020. He did not agree. And this person is a white, male, African speaking. And we were paired together because, we've got to be black and white in South Africa sometimes. So because we were paired together in this project, we had to write and agree on the report. And the person contested this line that I had put, this phrase, that these identity-based tensions are fueled by these Africans enclaves. However, in his own writing, which was not a response to my, so don't get me wrong, his writing was not a response to my paragraph. He was also writing as part of this big project, but we were reading each other's work because at the end we had to bring each other's work into one document. So he had written, as part of the good things that he wrote, 26 years into democracy, the country is still reeling from the backlog of its painful history that is compounded by more recent state of institutional neglect, poor economic, cultural norms, poor economy and cultural norms that justify excess performance. And I read this and I was thinking, really? So as South Africans, we've got cultural norms that justify excess, because there are few ANC-aligned people who are with the tenderpreneurs and who are flaunting a lot of money that they steal from the government. You are defining that and describing it in this important document as a cultural norm of a South African. I disagreed strongly. I still disagree. I still believe that a lot of South Africans, more than the average South African, still lives an ordinary, normal life where they do not have excess, where they do not have a lifestyle that is excess and that is being flaunted. Yes, there are few individuals who have access to a lot of money than they probably could have or should have had, but that does not justify us researchers writing about South Africans as a society that has developed cultural norms that justify excess. And then there was this tug of war between me and my colleague. We spent about a week talking about this. Him not agreeing about the African enclave, me not agreeing about describing South Africans in these ways, and I still do not agree. So I'm giving these examples because I want to show that for me, it's very important that we think about these things throughout our work. Sorry, did I just jump? So as a researcher, you may be flooded with the we may be flooded and possibly overwhelmed by research questions, by data, and some of these might trigger intense feelings and unresolved emotional issues. And I realized at this point, but between me and IE, this is exactly what was happening. He did not agree with white Africans' racism, but he still did not want me to paint a picture that there are still in 2020 racist Africans' tendencies in this country. So he became very emotional about it. But I also did not agree with the poverty that I see every day around me amongst black people. And it was an emotional issue for me, for him to want us to represent South Africans as people who are justifying excess, because we don't justify excess. And so we got into that tug of war, which I think you will get into in your life as researchers. You may be personally changed by the experience of hearing stories in vivid details that are shared by your respondents in uncertain and fragile situations. This happens in both quantitative and qualitative research, but more so in qualitative research. We are lucky that with the COVID 2020 situation and the post-2020 era, we're going to probably move a lot of our work to online, so people are not going to see us. But when people saw us, it also mattered how we dressed. It will matter more now how we communicate with people. We have to be, even those of us for whom things come, hot and fast, sometimes we have to pace ourselves and be very nice and talk like the previous speaker, Oyama, so that we don't appear to be angry at people. It's very important that we reach out to people because there's a lot of social isolation that is coming with COVID-19. It's very important that we make people feel, comfortable as well in our work. And when people feel comfortable, it is because we do not pass judgment. And it's very important when you do work on informality in the cities to learn to not be judgmental, because we can easily slip into that situation, especially if you have never experienced poverty in the ways in which people who live on the fringes of the city experience poverty. It's very easy for us to think that people are in those situations because they choose to, because they are lazy, because they could do something differently, because they could do something better. When we've been privileged to have opportunities in life to set our foot at universities and study, it's very easy for us to think that we did this because of our capability, and we forget the doors that were opened for us by funders like Bosch and others, for example. So it's very important that as part of our ethical behavior as researchers, we build what I call shared humanity for better understanding between ourselves and our research participants. We need to always do just to research participants. What do we mean by this? We need to always give them an opportunity to consent. We should not try and get people to agree to our studies through undue inducement. I'm going to talk also about the position of research incentives, therapeutic misconceptions, and dual relationships. In terms of informed consent, you have heard this and you've probably written it in your application for ethics. But informed consent is a process. It is not an event. And the timing of the recruitment, contact, and the clarity of the initial meeting and the description of the study to your community is very important. However, when we do that, we should not confuse that with consent, gaining entry into the community. Getting to Danone, because an example was made earlier about Danone, so I will stick to Danone. So going to Danone to speak to the councillor about doing research in this place, to speak to the farm owners association about doing research in this place, to speak to the clinic manager and the district superintendent. It doesn't mean that the people have already agreed to be interviewed by you. So we should always not mix gaining entry with consent. People who are going to now participate in the study still need to go through giving their own individual consent. Remember, it is not the what, but the how. Some research ethics committees will prioritize that you give written consent and you provide evidence that all your participants have given written consent. We know why this is the case. We revisited it in the first slides when we talked about colonialism and colonialization and how we have been subjects of the world that prioritizes certain forms of knowing. For example, the written text. So in a different world, what is written on paper is more important than what is said. But in another world, for example, I know in some parts of my society, oral history, oral stories are as important as what other people think is important in written format. So when you give verbal consent, it's also considered to be acceptable to some studies. So it is whether people have actually given the verbal consent that is important. And what we always encourage the field workers to do, if your participants disagree to giving a signature in a written form, and they can participate, but they're not going to read your 3-page information sheet. They're not going to read, in addition to the information sheet, another full-page consent form, which has an audio recording consent that's separate from the actual consent, all the things that the ethics committee asks for. But because they are not going to read that, it doesn't mean they don't want to participate in your study. If you verbally present your study to them and they agree to participate in the study, then you can record their consent as verbal consent. What is important is that your participants should have the capacity to consent to the study. And there are ways in which you can establish capacity in your own study. Again, it is contextual, it differs from study to study. The next thing is that your participants should be able to comprehend what you are telling them. So please stay away from scientific jargon. Stay away from the epistemologies and the ontologies in your research study. If your scientific jargon is fascinating for you, it is not fascinating to the research participants. Translate into the simplest language. If you're going to do your consent in English, your English should be simple. If you're going to translate into the local language, that's even much better. Translate into the local language and make sure that your local language simplifies your concepts for your participants. Also, make sure that your participants understand that they have a choice to say yes or no to participating in your study, so that they don't feel that they did not have a choice. Remember, there is a thin line between being forced and not having a choice. So you can easily say, but I did not force people to participate in this study. But what choice did you give them that they have a choice to not participate? So in many instances, you will remember in your own life where you did not feel forced to do something, but at the same time, you did not feel that you had a choice to say no. So make your participants aware that their participation is voluntary and that they can say no if they do not wish to participate. And to ensure that your participants have comprehension of the research that you are going to be doing, it's very important that you ask them to communicate the elements of your study back to you. I always do that. So once I've presented the study, or when I train field workers, I train them to present the study, and then I say to them, once you've presented the study, ask your prospective participant to then summarize it back to you that, okay, I agree to participate in the study on COVID-19. I agree that you will take a swab. I agree that you will take it to the lab and that I will get my results in 14 days. I agree that by taking the swab, that does not mean that I'm getting treatment. And I agree that does not mean that if the vaccine is found, I'll be the first one in the queue to get the vaccine. So all the things you've told them, they should be able to re-communicate those things back to you. So rather than one formalized document signing moment, I've already expressed that consent is something that is a process, and it is negotiable between the researcher and the community or the participants. So it may be prolonged. And many potential participants may complete the first stage of recruitment for your study, but then they can cancel the interview later. It is okay. Remember, they have a choice. And also, for not wanting to display rudeness and impoliteness, some people may technically agree to participate in your study when in fact it is because they know you work in the department of this and that, or they know you are a lecturer, and so they don't want to say no to you, or they know you because your sister teaches in the school where their children go, so they don't want to say no to you. You should be aware of those relationships, and you should be able to make people understand that they should be free. They should not agree because they desire to be socially acceptable in your network. And as a researcher, yes? Oh, sure. So as a researcher also, we know that you are concerned about getting the data. But what you are concerned about getting the data, it is important that you constantly ask the question about whether getting the data from participants who are not fully involved in your study is worth it. So if the participants appear to not be interesting, it's important that you reconsider their enrollment or continued participation if they had already started to participate in the study. So it's very important that we know how and when to address continued informed consent, because it is important for participants. But it is not only important for participants, it's also important for the integrity of the data, because if you continue to engage with a community or with individual participants who are not interested in your study, that could compromise your data. They could lie, for example, in your study, or they could be very tired to give you considered answers, because you also want them to give considered answers. And if you see that people are not into participating, either you should rather reschedule your appointments, or you should shorten your questions if you are able to do that. In a qualitative study, for example, it's possible to shorten your questions than in a quantitative study. So we know that the threats to informed consent, absence of sobriety is one of the threats to informed consent. So unless you come from South Africa, you probably are not familiar. In South Africa, we're the only country in the world, I think we do a lot of things in South Africa, including a church called Gabula Church. So in that church, you can go to church and you are drunk. In fact, you can carry your bottle of whiskey to church in Gabula Church in South Africa. It is a church, it exists. However, don't try to do what Gabula Church is doing with your research and bring participants or approach participants who are not sober. When people are not sober, they don't make good judgments. Also, when people have social isolation, they fall under the group that we call vulnerable groups. So it's very important that in your study, in the inner city, you map out who are the vulnerable groups, because these groups differ from place to place. It's also important that you understand the issue that people are facing, so that if participants are dissatisfied or unhappy with some of the questions in your questionnaire, then you double check with them if they are happy to continue and answer your questions, because some people might feel that some of your questions are too intrusive, too personal, and too private. So if you see in their behavior when you or when you are doing face-to-face interviews. Unfortunately, we can't see that when we do online interviews. And if you've structured your questionnaire in such a way that with an online interview, all the questions need to be answered, you're not giving people an option to not answer the questions, then you're not going to see when they just click, agree, disagree, even if they don't agree or disagree, but because they just don't want to be bothered by your intrusive questions. Some people, especially in the inner city with the groups that you will be working with, have multiple and ongoing stressors already by being members of the population that we have an interest in the informal city. We know that they will have multiple stressors. We know that, especially women, please consider that they will be multitasking. We saw it with the COVID-19, how women are multitasking. So you need to consider that. So people will, will get tired, and it's very important that when fatigue sets in, you give people an allowance to take a break or to go. That's being ethical as a researcher. The other principle that I would like us to cover is undue inducement. And undue inducement occurs when a person makes a choice in circumstances in which external factors are likely to have an inappropriate influence on their decision making. Please remember, with undue inducement, the most important thing is inappropriate influence. Did you inappropriately influence this person, right? So, undue inducement is a better way, for example, of describing ethical concerns about the impact of money on informed consent. The next slide is going to talk about reimbursement. So, in big studies, especially in big studies that are funded, there's usually research incentives. I love research incentives, don't get me wrong. I participate in studies that have research incentives a lot because I love research incentives. It doesn't matter what they are. Whether you give me a time, I'm happy. If you give me money, I'm even happier. So I love research incentives. However, is the incentive big enough to unduly influence me to say yes if I was going to say no? So the incentive that you consider to give in your study should not be too big so that people have to, even if I was going to say no, I can't say no for 1,000 rands. Like really now, I can't say no for 1,000 rands. So it should not be too big. Also, it differs from study to study. In medical research, for example, they set the bar. So they would say, I think in South Africa, if I'm correct, you can't give reimbursement that is, I think they set it around 250 or 350. So it's around 250 or 350. So each, either the research community of, in a particular discipline will set the bar. If they don't, if they have ethics committees, then the ethics committees will then make a recommendation that if a study is a medical study and you're going to do tests and keep people at the hospital for this long, then you need to give them not less than 350 but not more than 500 rands. So they will do that, for example. And in almost all the studies that I've been involved with, especially my academic work, I give reimbursement. It's consultancy work where it's tricky because it depends on whether your client in consultancy work agrees with the reimbursement. If they did not build it into the consultancy fee, then you can't reimburse. But in academic work, if I can build it in the proposal when I apply for funding, I always try to do that because, again, of the kind of community that I end up working with. I usually work with, just like you, all the fellows who are listening today, I work with people in the informal city, I work with people in the villages, in the townships, and I feel that it is respectful for me to honor their time. Because if I ask someone to come and have an interview for me for 1 hour, and I'm based at a venue, at a school, they're going to walk from their house to come and meet me at the school, wait for me about 10 minutes whilst I'm finishing something, start the interview, finish in an hour's time or 1 hour, 10 minutes, then walk back to their house. They've already spent about 3 hours of their time. They would have gone to do washing for 3 hours and get paid 250. So I might as well give them something, right? So I do always try to give reimbursement. But reimbursement is not only in the form of money, and undue inducement is not only resulting from reimbursements in research, but it's also resulting from the things that we say with our mouths when we promise people. So I had sent some field workers to do field work for me, and I listened to their audios when they come back from the field, and I listened from the start to the end just to know what did they say in the interview. And these were qualitative interviews, and I heard my interviewer saying to a group of people in a focus group, maybe there are some companies who are involved, you may never know, maybe they could come back and help you guys. That was undue inducement in my conception, because I did not ask the field worker to promise people that there will be companies who will come to this township and help people. So we should not make those promises, because here is what a participant then said later in the interview. He said, I heard you mention these things, but I also heard you mention other things that the community is complaining about. Maybe you can help. So by saying that, the field worker created an expectation that there could be some help that comes to the community. Remember, as researchers, we don't do research to bring help to the communities. We do hope that it will change their lives, but we don't bring direct and immediate help. Our job as researchers is knowledge production. We only produce knowledge with the hope that there is a clever politician who is a policy, a duty bearer, who's going to take this policy and policy brief and make decisions and then deliver the necessary needed services to the inner city and the townships. So I need you to go to your chat and type for us research incentives. Do you think that research incentives are good or not good? It's important that we hear your views as well, so that we don't leave this room thinking that we are on the same page. And also it's important that you don't agree with everything that I say. So type on your chat box if you think research incentives are good, or if you think research incentives are not good, or if you say it depends. I've already told you my own view. My own view in the previous slide, I told you about it. But it's up to you now to say, do you think it is okay for us researchers to give research incentives? Do you think it is not okay, or do you think it depends? So research incentives are sometimes offered to participants in research, that is not always. And research respondents may be paid or otherwise rewarded with a gift card or airtime for participating in our research studies. And incentives are frequently used when the benefit of the study to the study participants is otherwise remote or non-existent. Sometimes I've heard some of my colleagues, because this is an issue we discuss a lot as colleagues about research incentives, and some of my colleagues say that they support that we provide research incentives and that we let the participants know ahead of time. And they respect that participants are still going to make an independent decision whether to participate or not to participate. They do not think that the airtime we give participants or the pack of stationery we give participants is going to unduly induce them to participate if they were not going to participate. However, some researchers say, I do give participants something. However, I don't tell them ahead of time. So I come to the community, I introduce the study, I tell them I'm going to be doing work on their perceptions of the graveyards, and we're going to have this work in two ways. We're going to collect quantitative data, qualitative data. Then I do all the interviews. Then when all is done, without them expecting it, some researchers say, then because I've budgeted for the incentives, because remember, when you collect the informed consent form, that's a document that has the personal details of the participant. You, as the researcher, you have access to your informed consent forms. So you can go back to the consent forms if you had asked them to put their numbers, for example. And you can then send them an SMS that tells them who you are and that you were in this community 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and you will be loading airtime into their phones as a token of appreciation. So they say we don't tell them ahead of time, but we do give people research incentives. So Prof. Anyamba yesterday also classified the informal city into 4 categories: the survivalist, primary, intermediate, and the affluent. And depending on where you are in the informal city, you are probably in the survivalist or primary, but you will have different forms of access to the powers that be. And you will have different forms of access to your rights. We know that human rights should be universal, but we know that access to these universal rights is not equal. So depending on whether you occupy a subaltern or a superior position, you may have access to speak and participate in the corridors of power. If you feel in life that you don't have access to speak in the corridors of power, and then there is research that's coming to your part of the town, guess what? It becomes your opportunity to tell the local government what you've always wanted to tell them that next time they will not see your ex, and these are the reasons that they will not see your ex. So people use research as an opportunity to access and to demand justice, and we should allow people to do that. However, the other ethical principle in our textbooks is the principle of avoid what we call therapeutic misconceptions. That's an ethical principle. Whilst people think that I am so in pain because I've lost all that I had, and I lost my house in the floods that were sweeping all our houses at Nyanga East in Cape Town, and the government did not rebuild our houses because they want us to move from this riverbank because they tell us that it is unsafe and we are not going to move. But I am in pain because I lost all my belongings. And then people think that you are going to come here and comfort them for the pain that they have experienced. That is not your role as a researcher, so tells your textbook. Our role is to gather information from them and not to make them feel better or feel good about their situation. So our role is not to say, it will be okay, Mama. I know you have lost, your house and your belongings with the fires that, swept the whole informal settlement. This research is very good, Mama, and it's going to make you feel, no. That's not why we are there. Interviews can generate positive feelings and change amongst people. We know that. So if it does happen naturally on their side as respondents, that they feel better after speaking to you, which does happen, in fact, that sometimes after you've had a conversation with, I also participate in research, and sometimes after having a conversation with an interviewer, I do feel better about a particular subject that has been bothering me. And sometimes it's because it's been bothering me, that's why I say, yes, I'm going to participate in that study. So sometimes people seek opportunities for help to discuss their experiences. And these are the things that our participants have told us. So when I work with field workers, I always ask them to gather feedback from the field and give it back to us. One of my colleagues from the Medical Research Council, Professor Yandisa Skweyiya, who works with Professor Rachel Dukes, conducted a study, and the study was published. The study is asking participants, I think they went back 4 months after the survey to ask the participants, why did you agree to participate in that survey? So the participants were saying things like, the issue, which is a GPV issue for their work, the issue that I'm uncomfortable with is the one that the researcher should know about. He should know about it and do something about it. He can tell someone else about it, knowing that I am talking to a person who is going to help me. So some people participate in our surveys because they think that we are going to help them. And this is what the other participants said. All I can say is I am happy. However, if there's anything that you can do to assist us from your organization, it will be highly appreciated. So I do want you to know that when you go out there, people are going to look up to you and expect that you are going to help them. So people are going to expect some therapy, but not only therapy, but also practical help sometimes. Yeah. So we do, as researchers who write textbook, call these misconceptions. But in all honesty, if you watched the video that I had sent earlier, please do watch the video. You will see how I make an argument about what happens in these communities that are underserviced, that do not have these services that should be brought to them. And then there are psychologists who are walking around with a blue clipboard and collecting data, but they don't give counseling. Then it's in the context where it is happening. Then it calls on our ethical obligation as African researchers, as researchers in the global south, as researchers in contexts that have been neglected for a long time, and as a result are underdeveloped and are unable to make sure that all our communities receive these services. We know that emotions are a natural response to the discussion of an intense experience and crucial for a complete understanding of participants' perceptions of an event or an issue. So people are going to cry in your interview. So what do you do when people cry? Do you cry with them? Do you provide, basic counseling when people cry? Research ethics suggests that you don't. But watch my video to see what I think we should start to have a conversation about in our continent. So through the research encounter, a participant may have first-time recognition of trauma or potentially re-experience the trauma while telling the story. And this possibly should not be avoided, but rather anticipated and planned for in our research studies. So fears of damage sometimes rendered by emotional expression and reactions during an interview generate concerns on the side of the researchers that our organizations are going to be held responsible for extending participants' problems. So part of the reason why the ethics committee is concerned about you opening a can of worms is because as the university or as the institution that you work for or where you study, we are not going to be able to help. So why ask people about their experiences as sex workers in Hillbrow if when they tell you about all the drug abuse that they get subjected to by their pimps, then you're not going to do anything. You can't take them out of that environment. But that was not the point of research. The point of research was not to resolve the problems of sex workers in Hillbrow. The point of research was to hear from them, how do you do your job? And how does drug use influence the way you do your job? How does violence filter in the way you do your job in the streets of Hillbrow? Right? But we've got to respond to the emotions and be able to manage the expectations and reactions from our participants. So the researcher's natural response to expressed distress could include you feeling guilty that you have opened a can of worms for your participants or that you have caused pain, because some of them may start crying in the course of the interview. And you might want to offer comforting words. And this phenomenon is known as therapeutic misconceptions, and it rests on both sides. Both the researcher and the respondent can have these misconceptions about why we are here in this interview. So interviews should never be construed as professional health assistance. Research ethics suggests that you should refer your respondents to where they will get help. So you need to establish the referral points before you even start your study. That is, if there are referral points. Try to go to Kafumvaba and see if there is a psychologist for you to refer to. So, whilst in some or in most of these places you may not find a referral point, or you may not find a psychologist to refer to, you are cautioned still to not turn interviews into some kind of therapy and start giving advice to people, because you might give the wrong advice. So it's just best to sit there, be quiet, and wait. And you can only do that if you are aware of your own issues. That's why you need to read and read and read and know what to expect before you go to the field. That's why you need to become aware of where your values stand in relation to the topic that you are studying. So if you pity poverty and you're going to study people who are poor, like people can be poor in ways that you have never imagined before, and you go to these places where 3 generations live in one household but nobody is working. You have never seen that in your life. You've never experienced 3 generations living in one foreign house with no one who is working. And for you, that could cause you pain. And once you are also expressing pain, then your participants also relieve or get traumatized by their own pain that they live with every day. So it's very important that we become aware of ourselves. Now, research experts in ethics suggest that we should neutralize our feelings. So we should be able to do what they call bracket your feelings. So you should be able to be aware of your beliefs and feelings, understand your respondents and where you stand, but put yours aside. You need to work on yourself and your emotions before you go to the field so that you don't find yourself in that situation. So the other one is dual relationships and managing conflict of interest. It's very easy in research to get into dual relationships if you're doing research where you come from. So we are cautioned about not doing research where we will be interviewing our friends, interview family, interview colleagues, interview clients. So just avoid interviewing people that you know in research. However, there is no standard. There is no rule that say you should not, but research ethics encourage you to not do that, because there are two things that might happen, and I address this in a chapter that I've written. I've given you the references. I hope it's there at the end of the presentation. So two things might happen. Your participant might not tell you all the information because they assume that you already know their life. So you already know some of these things because you come from the same family. So they may not disclose everything. So it's very important that you try and avoid people. But also, you may not probe enough. You may not ask them everything. Because also at the back of your mind, I mean, you know some of these things. And so you may not probe them. And yet the ways you know them are not exactly the ways in which the respondent was going to tell this story if they were being interviewed by somebody else. So because I know that black academics in South Africa have issues and are struggling and are starting behind and staying behind. And so when I interview other black academics, I already come with that assumption, right? However, I do not know the story of another black academic. They may not have had the same experience as Prof. Nduna. And so if I interview them, I may not probe some of the things because in my unconscious mind, they're already sitting there and I already think, or I may lead them to answers that fit what is already in my own mind. So it's very important that we don't interview people who share some kind of relationships with us. So it is natural and often acceptable for a researcher to share personal experiences in a study. But please, you are cautioned to not overshare. So don't over disclose because it becomes uncomfortable when you over disclose. It's okay to disclose because you can develop a relationship of trust with your research team or with your research participants when you tell them about your own experiences when you were studying at UCT and you were living in the fringes of Cape Town and how the inner city was rough for you. It's okay to tell them you were mugged once or twice in the inner city. But if you over disclose, sometimes that could create expectations from your research respondents. You are creating an impression that you and them are in the same WhatsApp group. And after the interviews, then they will want to take your number, they will want to befriend you, they will want to call you and ask how is your case going, because their case when they were mugged has been postponed 7 times and they are very angry at the magistrate court. And how is your case going, because you had disclosed your case to them as well. So to avoid those interactions that may happen post the interviews, we encourage you to not share a lot. We need to respect persons. And there are 3 things I'm going to quickly speak about when we talk about respect, which is anonymity, confidentiality, and privacy. Anonymity, we know it, I hope, because we've done honors and masters. Refers to data collected from respondents who are completely unknown to anyone associated with the survey. So your supervisor should not know who participated in your study. The only thing that should link your study and the participant is the informed consent form, and it should stay with only one person and it should be locked away. You should not share your consent form with other people because they need to have their privacy respected. Any information, I think also we need to know about this, and we probably know, that was discussed in the context of the interview should remain in the context of the interview. It should not be divulged outside the interview. However, think about what we spoke about earlier, that the context in the different countries are different, and so are the rules around the duty to report what we find out from the field. So I'm going to do in my second last slide, which I think comes after this one, the duty to report, which now might have you might think it conflicts with confidentiality, but actually it does not. So we should try by all means to do no harm, and when we do no harm, we know what we need to do. It's everything else that I've said so far and everything else that you learned in your honors and masters, but it's making sure that you minimize the risks. Some studies will always come with risks. You know, the vaccine for COVID, it will come with risks. Whether we like it or not, there will be risks for participating in some studies in research. However, we need to minimize the risks for our participants. If there are benefits, we need to be upfront about these benefits. In some study designs, For example, if you're doing implementation science, you are implementing an intervention at the same time you are doing research around the intervention. So already your community will benefit from implementation science. So if you're doing operations research, for example, you are testing at the same time giving the intervention, but testing the intervention as well. So in those circumstances, depending on your study design, then people are going to benefit from your study. However, some studies do not have that element. They don't have an intervention. And if they do, sometimes people are on the intervention arm, some are on the control arm. So they don't even know if they are getting the intervention or they are getting the placebo. So if they are getting the placebo, they may not get the benefit. But also, you don't know the benefits of something that you have not yet tested, whether it works or not. So it's very important that we think about these benefits. So it's important that we think about minimizing any risks. I said that. So I think this is my second last slide, which talks about the duty to report. So remember, I spoke about confidentiality, which is a promise to your research participants that anything and everything that we discuss in this room will be protected by the Shantan House rules, which means it will not leave this room. It will not leave this interview. However, depending on where you are, in Kenya, there will be different laws around the duty to report. In Ghana, there will be different laws. In South Africa, there are different laws. In South Africa, for example, some of the laws that I am aware of, if you are doing your work in your inner city, you discover child abuse, you have an obligation to report it. If you don't report child abuse and you found it out when you were doing your research, you were complicit to the crime. If you discover elderly abuse, you have an obligation to report it. If you discover that there is a threat to life, whether it is murder or it is suicide, you have an obligation to report. Now, how do you negotiate this with the promise to confidentiality? In research, to be ethical, you need to discuss the duty to report with your research participants up front. So once you've gone through your information participants sheet and your consent form, you need to then say to them, as a researcher, I am bound by the following rules to report should I find criminal activities, for example, child abuse, or elderly abuse, or threats to life like murder or suicide. And at that point, when you discover that information, you are in the middle of the interview, let's say, for instance, and the person is already distressed and emotional and crying, and they are telling you that they've tried to take their lives and they've tried to, they took pills, but pills didn't work. They were thinking about rat poison. So you check with them. You were so Oyama, you just told me you were thinking about rat poison. Do you think that is what you were thinking about? Then your participant says, yes, I am thinking because I heard that it works effectively. So you already know that there is a threat for this person to commit suicide. Then you say to them, as a researcher, I have an obligation to help you. Can I pass your number to Lifeline? Can I pass your number to SADC? Can I pass your number to the suicide toll-free number? I have an obligation to make sure that there is a mental health professional. Remember, the duty to report is not only to get people to be caught and sent to jail. It's sometimes to help the people. So you have a duty to say, there is a situation where you are going to threaten your life, and I am being ethical and honoring my ethical obligation as a researcher, that I'm going to have to link you to a mental health professional so that you receive some help. So that is the part of the duty to report. The last slide is data ownership. Now, I'm going to ask, because I need to check that you are still awake and you are not sleeping, or you did not leave to go and attend to other things in your house, because we're doing this on Zoom. People leave us on Zoom and they go to attend to other things in their homes. So I need you to type on the chat box if data should be the property of the researcher or the respondents. If you say, of course, yes, data is the property of the respondents, you should type yes. If you say, no, data is the property of the researcher, you should stop, no, data should be the property of the researcher. Because it's very important that we know what you think. Remember, these ethics are contextual and they are negotiable. They are universal principles. However, we expect you to engage with these universal principles. So here is what I want to share with you. Data is never a property of the individual participants. In research, we do not allow the individual participant to keep their data. In quantitative studies, this is easy to do because in quantitative studies, we take all the responses, we put them in Excel, in Stata, in SPSS, and we aggregate, and MZ cannot even find their responses, right? So people can't find their responses with ease. Yes, we do sometimes use ID numbers, not their Green Book ID number, right? Don't get me wrong. We use study ID number. So we create a study number for each observation. We call them observations. So for each observation in the study, we create a study ID number. Then we sometimes are able to match the study ID number, especially, for example, if you want to be able to follow up on your participants. If it's a 3-year study with a follow-up, you want to be able to link this person for a follow-up interview. But generally, people should not be able to have access to their audio recordings if it was a qualitative study. Now, again, you might say to me, oh no, hands up, here is my hand up, Prof. But what about member checking? Because I read a textbook that spoke about member checking. I can tell you now what is member checking. Member checking is when you've interviewed your respondent. You transcribe the interview. You want to make sure that what you've got on paper is what they said. You give them the transcribed version. You say to them, dear Naomi, thank you very much for participating in my study, where I wanted to hear about your experiences of being a street vendor in Harare. Please read the transcript and let me know if it is correct. Then they read it. If it is correct, they give it to you. You are checking with them. There's another concept that we use for it, but you allow people to check it. What we sometimes do, we don't give it to the individual person. We say, we're going to first do preliminary analysis of the data. And then once we've done preliminary analysis of the data, we take the preliminary findings. Well, now you cannot say, this is what Naomi said, this is what Oyama said, this is what Prof. Mbati said. Where you're going to bring all the data as the preliminary findings to all your street vendors from Harare that you interviewed. And you say to them, these are the findings that I've got. Are these findings correct? Are these the things that are real for you that you've said to us when we were here last month? Then they could agree, or they could say, no, we didn't want to put it that way. That was a mistake. This is how we want to put it. Then at which point you are then allowed to make corrections based on their corrections. So that doesn't mean they own the data. The data still belongs to you. You don't leave the data. However, because I am now also just to mention that we should always make sure that the names of the participants, when we do that, the member checking, we've removed the name of the participant and we put the names so that people don't see what they said. And when we write acknowledgements in our thesis and in our studies, we should not write names of the people who helped us with the data. Last point for today, because we are now I'm in the post-2020, I don't know about you, but because I'm already in the post-2020 era, I'm imagining that we're going to be doing a lot of our data collection over technology-assisted gadgets. So we're going to be calling people on Zoom, on Skype, on Blue Button Big, on Microsoft Teams, on Blue Jeans. There's too many of these platforms now that we're going to be using, on WhatsApp video calls. You don't have control over whether the other person can or cannot record themselves where they are. So as I speak to you now, I could have recorded myself. What are you going to say if your research participants recorded themselves? Are you going to ensure? How are you going to ensure? So this is a new ethical conundrum. I'm hoping that some of the fellows will write a paper on this, and I will read their paper, and I will use it to teach the next time I'm invited to teach in this fellowship. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Prof. Can I answer that quickly? I can answer that quickly by referring all the fellows, because some people might have that question, to a study that was done by Professor Sakim Fekane from the University of the Western Cape. He addresses drinking with his participants in Pumalanga. So I'm not going to tell you what he did. I'm going to ask you to go and find his paper, because he's published on drinking with participants. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, thanks. I will look at the chat. So the second question is easy because it's not directed at me. It's directed at the institute. I think the question is a question of clarity. I think Edwin is asking if, as fellows, the institute has any guidelines for them in terms of ethics. So I will not be able to answer that because that is something that the sponsor can answer. Usually, sponsors stay away from a conversation about ethics as long as the researchers follow the ethical guidelines in respect of their disciplines. So usually the sponsors will say the research should always be approved by an ethics committee, and that gives them enough comfort that the research was undertaken under ethical guidance. But they can answer on that. And then the question from Prof. Scholes. I completely agree with you, Prof, that the ethics committees are set to look at the ethical aspects of a study. And that they do sometimes get into the study design. So there's a thin line sometimes between the study design and the ethics. Because remember, as I've suggested in my presentation, the ethics needs to be considered for the whole knowledge production exercise. So they do not only apply in relation to how you will treat a participant, they apply to the research question. Why are you asking this research question in the ways in which you are asking the question, up to the publication? So I think whilst we expect the ethics committees to look only at the ethics, and if everything is okay with anonymity and confidentiality and undue inducements, then we expect them to not look at the study design. Let me make an example with the sample size, for example. If the ethics committee overlooks a sample size that is small, what that means is the student can go ahead and conduct the research with a small sample size. If the sample size is not powered, they did not do a sample size calculation to power their study at the right level, then they will not have correct results. So they will have distorted results, and they will want to publish distorted results. Then we will end up with a Lancet, situation, and we don't want to end up with that situation. So we don't want to end up with results that are distorted or that are not meaningful because the sample size was not powered. So I think it's okay for the ethics committee, if there is expertise in that committee, to comment on other aspects of the study. If it is not on the sample size, for example, the ethics committee might even comment on your literature review. Maybe as a supervisor you think, but what has that got to do with you, because we sent this for your ethics expertise. However, if a student does not do adequate literature review, that's an ethics, that's a malpractice in research. You can't go into your study and you don't read, because then we are allowing students to think that they can get away with not reading enough. Then when they don't read enough, they don't immerse themselves, then they don't engage with the knowledge. Then they think that their knowledge is the first. Then they write all these sort of statements that we read about, that this is the first study to be published on people who live without fathers in Nairobi. And yet, when they try to publish the study, the peer reviewers are experts in their field, and they know what the truth is. And they look at it and they shake their heads because they think, why is this student saying this? Because they have not read 15 other articles I know of in this field. Because the ethics committee does not bother itself to note. So I think it's important. Yes, they may not act as gatekeepers. They may not say this study should not happen, but they should be able to say, we note that your literature review is lacking because there are many other studies in this field. Because in the ethics committee, maybe there is an expert in that field, and they might draw attention to your student that please make sure to read so and so and so and so's work. I think it's okay for the ethics committee to say, we note that your sample size was not calculated properly. Please go to this formula for calculating the sample size and make sure that your study has enough power, so that we don't waste resources undertaking studies that are not going to be meaningful at the end of the day, that will not inform policy and interventions, because the studies themselves were not meaningful studies. So I think I understand your frustration, and because I also go through that frustration sometimes, I do appeal. So when the ethics committee does not seem to understand what I'm doing, then I do write a letter of appeal on behalf of my student. I first request the student to write the appeal themselves, because my relationship with the student is a trainee-trainer relationship. So I'm training the student to stand up for themselves. So when the student comes crying, oh, this is the feedback from the ethics, they are asking for all of this and all of that, and I read the feedback. Then I say, for each of these, fix all that you think is, is possible to fix, and let me know what is not possible to fix and tell me why. Then if you feel that you were misunderstood by someone who was reviewing your proposal, then write a response, because they need to get used to that, because we do that all the time to our peer reviewers and editors of journals. So write a response to the ethics committee. Respectfully, dear chairperson of the ethics committee, I feel that the committee misunderstood my sample size. The reason why my sample size is small is because I'm doing qualitative research, and in qualitative research, I can interview one person. So that, because sometimes we need to educate our ethics committees. Remember, they don't come from the same background as you. So for them, maybe some of the big professors who sit in ethics committees are used to studies with 23,000 participants, because they get data that is already routinely collected by the service providers. And you are not working with routinely collected data. Maybe you are going to send your student to go and collect data, and this is a small study. So the student should own that process to respond to the chairperson and explain why they will be interviewing only 300 people. Because maybe the phenomenon itself is so uncommon that it does not happen to many people. So I am not going to go and interview and do research on the experiences of transgender people in Nairobi and expects to interview 1,000 people. There will not be 1,000 transgender people to find in Nairobi to interview. So I can't have an ethics committee that's asking me to increase my sample size, because we know, one, transgender people are few. Not only are they few, but there are very few to come out. Even those who are transgender don't even know that they are transgender themselves. So we need to be able to engage with our ethics committees in those ways. We should see this as a process, as a learning process between ourselves as researchers and members of the ethics committees. Thank you. Uphinde bakumeka kwembi? Yeah. Ngoba uthiwa ekuseni uvukile? Yo. Abelana uphiko. Hayi moyena. Hey, you share a lot in common with Prof. Mbati. Now you must read his papers.